Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the panel on new models for education philanthropy. I'm Michael Horn, a senior strategist at Guild Education, and delighted by this conversation because I think we've got like the who's who of perspectives on the evolving face of education philanthropy and the opportunities and challenges that we'll get into. So just delighted for this conversation. We've got Tom, who leads Strada, Angela from New Profit, Ralph from ETS, and Katy from Siegel Family Endowment. And we're going to dive right in. I'm going to try to fade away as this goes on. But first, a quick lightning round just to level set everyone so that everyone knows who's out there. Just a quick 30 seconds on your fund, what you all do, mission and focus. Katy, if you want to start.
Sure. At Siegel Family Endowment, we're focused on the impact of technology on society, and we operationalize that across 3 verticals of learning, workforce, and infrastructure. So relevant to this panel, in learning, we're really focused on computational thinking, some edtech tools, and the future of learning, school design, what learning should look like if we're going to equip all students to be successful citizens.
Sure. So ETS Capital is a relatively new part of ETS, and we're focused on primarily investments, equity investments, but then also growth capital relationships and mergers and acquisitions. Our focus is really not only domestic US, but internationally. We started to do a couple of international deals, I think, last year, and you're going to probably see announcements of more international deals this year. It's really a focus on developing relationships that can really benefit not only ETS, but also benefit the companies that we engage and collaborate with. So it really is a focus on being truly synergistic and bringing the value of ETS's businesses to the forefront.
Angela Jackson. So at New Profit, we are a 22-year-old venture philanthropy firm and modeled off of a VC model. So we make equity investments with grants with unrestricted capital. We also invest in for-profit organizations. And our thesis is around a future of work, what we call an equitable future of work. So looking at accelerated learning programs that are focused on the 70 million US residents who don't have a 4-year degree, and also thinking about the wraparound supports like innovations in childcare, transportation, and fintech.
So Strada works to identify and then scale the most effective solutions that move beyond completion to connect education and work more purposefully. We do that through 4 main pillars. We have grants and investments, which are really kind of 2 sides of the same coin. We can talk about that later. We own and operate a series of affiliates that are in that space. And then we also have what we call stakeholder engagement, which is how we work with people like this here on the panel, institutions, employers, and policymakers as well.
So I'd love to get right into the conversation of the panel itself in terms of new models, and you all have views across the education philanthropy sector, and I'm just curious, what do you all see as the major trends that are evolving in these new models as you look out at the landscape? Angela, if you want to kick us off.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, mentioned New Profit's been around for 22 years. We are focused on social entrepreneurs. A trend that we're seeing lately is that blurring of the line between 501c3s and for-profits, especially when you're looking in this kind of accelerated learning space. And so that's really pushed us to invest in entrepreneurs who are really working at that intersection of profit and purpose. The other thing that we're seeing in the field right now is more collaboration, and we're really excited about this. When we look at our investments, we're also looking at co-investors that we're bringing on that are also mission aligned with us, because we know the checks that we write, $1 million, the lowest is $250, that doesn't make a company, that we're going to need more collaboration and more aligned investors.
So if I could jump in there, I think a lot of the points that Angela made, I totally agree with. I think that what I've heard that's consistent around the panel is this concept of investments, and I think we're all doing investments at some level. So we don't do grants at all, so we're not at that level. I think we tend to impact more with the venture philanthropy model, so we're making financial investments. Also, I think our group tends to focus more on later deals. And so that means that our typical numbers are maybe something on the order of $2 million to $20 million in terms of investments. And so I think for us, we really definitely need to find partners who are willing to work at that earlier stage, can really provide deal flow for us at that slightly larger stage. So I think that level of connectivity, I think, is key.
I think one of the things that I've noticed, having worked in this space for a while, I used to have hair when I first started, is that foundations, I used to work for a big foundation, and grants were really the coin of the realm. And I remember, this wasn't that long ago, this was 10 or 11 years ago, and I remember when we started doing our first program-related investments, it was, oh my goodness, this is so revolutionary and so innovative, and there were so few foundations that did them. And then I stepped away for a while, I worked for a for-profit education company, and I came back, and those types of investments that foundations were doing have become all the rage. So it actually changed fairly quickly. I think with Strada, the part that we really focus on is how can we bring to bear those 4 levers I described, but in particular with the affiliates that we own and operate. There are, we can control and operate them, and we can learn from them more directly. And so I think that's a differentiator for us. We don't have them to, they're all nonprofit for the most part. We don't have them to earn massive margins. We have them really to learn from and to scale and to share what we're learning with the field. And that's a bit of a differentiator for Strada, but I think all of the combinations, all of what my peers up here are talking about is we face a very, kind of irrespective of whether you're in early childhood or if you're in education and career, the problems that those areas face are very complicated, and they're entrenched, and they've gone on for generations, and you can't rely on one form of allocation of capital to solve the problems. You need really a multifaceted approach to it. So,
just building on that, Tom, one thing that we've seen, Strada has taken that internal approach by having those different levers. When we think about our investing, we're taking a systems approach and really looking at the ecosystem. So while we make direct investments, we're also investing in policy work. New Profit as a policy arm, America Forward, because we know it's great to make one investment, but how do we really see systems change if we're talking about reaching 70 million people? And so we've surrounded strategic partners that include policy, research that we want to disseminate, and like I mentioned, other VCs who want to come to the table to hold the line on the mission investments.
Picking up on that, I think what we see as a foundation that's doing slightly more traditional work at the intersection of all these things is that we need to make these connections, that we need to pull together the tool builders and the teachers and administrators, school leaders. We need to have conversation and community that leads to collaboration. The other thing that I would just add in terms of trends, and one that I'm really excited about, is that the growing access to tech tools has made it possible for proximate leaders who are closer to the communities they serve, who come from those communities, to actually be a part of the tool building process, to have a say in what the future of these tools look like, and to really be part of the design and leadership of programs that serve students across the country.
So you all laid out a bunch of different tools and mechanisms and ways you're investing. I mean, everything from acquisitions to venture investments in for-profit companies, programmatic grants, general operating grants. There's a lot of different tools that have been tossed out. Why have we, I'd love to dig a little bit into the why behind this. Why are we seeing this explosion in different types of investments? What are the motivations for changing that model? As you see, a decade ago, Tom, you said these were rare. What changed in either the landscape or the recognition from people in philanthropy that you had to start to use all these different tools?
I think it's a couple, well, maybe 2 or 3 things. The first thing is and I would say this is true whether it's early childhood, education to career, K-12 education, all of those areas are so fragmented. And so I think foundations realized, we're not a foundation, but I'll speak on their behalf. I think foundations realized that the single approach around grant allocation just wasn't getting the job done. And so they began to experiment with new ways of allocating capital. I think the other thing that happened was, frankly, the improvements in the markets. There's just a lot of cash on the sidelines, and so a lot of investors who may not have otherwise been interested in these spaces became more interested in them. And so they've been pushed in certain directions to I think, become more mission-oriented. And because foundations are now investors, they're a constituent that some of the companies and some of the other investors now have to pay attention to in a way that 10 or 15 years ago they didn't have to. The third area is that, and this is maybe a little more controversial, the third area is, I mean, at least from where I sit, I really think the failure of public policy and government to address some of these problems have led us to turn to players like the ones up on the stage to begin to address both identification and scale in a way that the government, frankly, had previously done in many cases. And I just think that's a lot more challenging nowadays for reasons that I don't have to get into. So.
Picking up on that last point, actually, I think philanthropy has always, we could say, over-indexed in education, right? We've always had a strong interest in helping to shape or reshape education systems. So it only makes sense that as the world has evolved, we've tried to evolve the models by which we do that work. And so we have this incredible growth and opportunity to do that. I think also on the government point, as tech has eaten the world, government has struggled to keep up in many regards. And so where philanthropy can be, I often say society's risk capital, it's become this huge opportunity to invest that capital in these changing systems that government has not been able to keep up with on the tech front.
And then at New Profit, the way we've been thinking about it, we've always prided ourselves on being entrepreneur-centric and really hearing from them about what they need. And that started from our earliest days when we gave unrestricted grants, which was unheard of 22 years ago in philanthropy. What we've learned from our entrepreneurs today is that they need access to different types of capital. And so if we really want to support them and follow their journey, some of them might need the friends and family grant capital. Some of them might need an equity investment because they're trying to prove to the market that they're investable. And so we want to make sure that we're sending the right signals to the market as we support the entrepreneurs that we believe in.
So I want to go a little bit deeper then on this because you all raised a number of points that are actually worth digging into. Among them are, as you're making these different investments, and as you said, it was unheard of when you started giving general operating grants without these restrictions on it. I remember well starting the Christensen Institute, and measurement was, we'll say, somewhat easier because it was so restrictive on programmatic grants. There was a clear outcome on the other end. This was a big trend to measure. Now that you're making all these different kinds of grants, there's return on investment that maybe your venture partners care about. Some of these things are hard to measure. How do you all think about impact and measurement and what you're optimizing for? And we can start to get into also the tensions on that. I'll double click on that in a moment, but I'd just love to think about how you're thinking about it and how do you hold yourself accountable for what you want to see?
So I'm glad you asked that question. I can't see them, but somewhere the Strada team is here, and we have there they are in the back. We have a team of about 10 researchers. We combine both market research that's more common in the for-profit space. We have academic research, and we have that capacity that we're increasingly unifying to really get at what we think is one of our core roles to play, which is identifying what works. So we have a great team, and it's a real core capacity and competency of ours, and we're very proud of it. I would say that there's a tendency in philanthropy to try to design the perfect mousetrap and to try to get your strategy, absolutely right from the gate, and that can be a little bit dangerous. I think there needs to be a fair amount of experimentation, and there needs to be a tolerance for, especially for example, if you're investing in a private equity fund or you're making a direct investment like New Profit does. You have to kind of meet the entrepreneur or meet the funder or the private equity firm where they are, and they don't need to have to 100% ascribe to your theory of change or your strategy. But if you view it as, I can't believe I'm saying this word because I don't particularly like this word, but if you view it as an ecosystem, trying to encourage that ecosystem to adopt your perspective doesn't require them to have to adopt it whole cloth. You can research, you can have a research arm that looks at sort of different parts of that ecosystem, and as long as it's sort of mission resonant, I think that's really the important part. They don't have to subscribe completely to your strategy, because your strategy will evolve and change. So,
Yeah, I think I totally agree with Tom's word ecosystem, although he doesn't seem to like the word. I think it really addresses the complicated system that we have to work through. I think that it is an ecosystem of relationships that we have to build and actually make work in this philanthropic system that we're in. I mean, what I effectively do is I run a corporate venture capital investment arm. That's effectively what we do. I mean, I would say 70% of our activities are venture-oriented, and we invest in anywhere from $2 million to, let's say, $20 million into a company. Now, we have to make decisions which are mission-oriented. Our decisions already also have to be financially driven. And then they also, frankly, have to meet the business relationships and the business needs of our various businesses within the corporation. So that means we have multiple stakeholders to work with. We can't do deals that don't make financial sense. The deals cannot have any sort of negative mission impact. And frankly, the deals have to make rational sense from a business unit impact. And so once you have to deal with these multiple stakeholder issues, it becomes sometimes challenging. I mean, I'll add on an extra layer, which is the international piece, which we haven't talked about thus far. So we are doing deals not just in the domestic US, but also globally. So we just closed a deal in China, in Shanghai, probably about 6 months ago. We're now closing our first deal in Bangalore, India. And so once you start to layer on those sort of international cross-border issues, that adds an extra layer of complexity. And I think a lot of times it's also healthy to sort of look to see who are the folks investing in these multi-jurisdictional companies. Certainly from the international side, we find a lot of times that it's folks like the World Bank, it's folks like the CDC, which is the European corporate development effort, which used to be government run but has now been spun off. So it's those kinds of companies. And then also, interesting enough, a lot of Chinese money and a lot of Middle Eastern money. And so particularly for a lot of those international markets where traditionally the US has not been as willing to jump in or not as quick to jump in, it's folks like the Middle Eastern folks, like the Chinese folks, who are more willing to jump in quicker.
At SFE, I've led our team to focus on something that we call inquiry-driven philanthropy, by which I mean we're not just concerned with the scale of your impact or the work that you're doing, but also whether or not it helps us derive insights into questions that we have about the world and how things can or should look. And so what I love about that is that it places us internally in a really important tension between the sort of honesty about what insights you can derive and what market you're impacting and what this tool or program actually does and what its potential is for scale or for the opportunity for growth. And so we take a view on scale that it doesn't have to mean that you're going to ultimately touch every student in the US or in the world, but rather that you have sort of an honesty in your intentionality about the addressable market that you can reach. And if that market is a certain subset of students, a certain geographic area, a certain sort of type of learning, we want to hear that and we want to understand what that can help us learn about how you can solve problems in segments of the market. So we don't have this view that everything we invest in, and we invest across very early stage ideas to bigger programs, that it has to be positioned to ultimately take over the world. We do want some things that are very big. We were longtime investors in Scratch, the platform for kids coding, for example, but we also have invested in smaller things that are going to teach us something about a really small segment of the population.
I think that's a really good point. I think there is sometimes this kind of false dichotomy that's set up between efficacy and scale. And I think, again, from the point of we're part of an ecosystem and having a little more tolerance, that for example, we're active in the coaching space, so providing personalized coaching to help individuals get through school or get through training and then progress into the job market. We could, through one of our affiliates, we have research to suggest that they're very effective at working, particularly within higher education, but increasingly with employers. But they're at a level of scale that is not quite as large. They're growing, but they're not at a huge level of scale. But we feel good about what their initial results are in terms of from an efficacy standpoint. That doesn't, however, prevent us from investing in another coaching company that has greater scale. Maybe the efficacy isn't quite as effective. Maybe they reach a different type of student. Maybe they deploy a different business model. But as long as we can measure what that effectiveness is, there's a trade-off between their scale and their efficacy. Now, if the trade-off is complete, that they're at a huge level of scale, but there's no efficacy, that's bad. But I think we should be willing to realize that to reach a certain level of scale, there may need to be a slight efficacy trade-off, and I think that's the way we approach it is that we're learning, and we kind of accept that as a given, and we don't need to be, I think efficacy is important, but we don't need to be overly religious about it, and to realize that scale and efficacy have a sort of a mutual relationship. So,
and for us at New Profit, we measure the things about growth, scale, numbers, but we also take a learning and systems orientation. And by that I mean we want to know what we can learn from these investments that could be applicable to others in the field. And I'll give you an example. Some recent investments that we made, we had founders who created net new jobs. And so really understanding a net new jobs for people who don't have a 4-year degree, which is really important for us. Understanding how they do that work and how we can apply it to other folks who are in our portfolio is like what we're interested in, because we're thinking there's 70 million US adults who don't have a 4-year degree. We need better systems. And so we're really thinking about investing in entrepreneurs who are reaching scale, but also who are having that systems level impact.
I want to double click on a number of things right now, but let's go a little bit deeper on the scale efficacy question, because like thinking about the balance on that, it sounds like in some ways you're applying a counterfactual standard to the efficacy, right? If it's better than what the opposite, sort of the absence of, it's worth doing. But that still seems to me to be a tension and trade-off and an art in that. How do you all think about the scale impact? Maybe certain things work in certain circumstances. If they have venture capital, though, they're going to be trying to go after the largest market possible. There's a bunch of tensions in that. How do you all think about it?
I will be a little provocative and say that I think venture capital in ed tech is dangerous in a lot of ways. I think if you're looking for outsized return, you end up with potentially products that reach a lot of kids but do very little for them, and that's not what we should be aiming toward in education. So that is not to say that all venture is bad and there should be no venture investment in education. I think there's an absolute place for it, and that there are segments, whether that's LMSs or other platform type things, where massive scale can be really useful. There are other places where that doesn't make sense, and we should be honest and thoughtful about who needs what kind of money. And the folks with the money should be honest and thoughtful about what you're looking for when you invest, and whether or not something is the right opportunity, and what sort of approach you're going to take to making sure that your investment pays off in impact or scale or return, whatever that looks like for you. I would rather support a dozen really strong tools or programs that have high efficacy, that are led by individuals who understand what they're trying to do and who they're trying to do it for, than two that cover the same market but not as well.
Katy, I was just going to say, you made it such an important point. I just want to double click on it. For us, it's scale, it's efficacy, but it's also equity. And so when we think about a lot of the ed tech tools that are out there right now, they're servicing and targeting people who already have a 4-year degree, who are in middle management, and who are looking to move up. When I talk about the 70 million who don't have a degree or who may have other barriers to employment, a lot of times they're treated as non-consumers. So even when you have an entrepreneur who's mission driven, when they're trying to scale, they're trying to get paying customers, and it may take a bit longer to service the folks who may not have dollars to spend them, and that's where public services come in. But I think that's important for us too. So just for scale's sake, if you're not reaching the people at the margins, we're not interested in investing in that.
I think the venture point is a good one, but I wouldn't overplay it, because venture is inherently more risky. Whether you're investing in education or fintech or energy, it is, regardless of the market, by definition, venture is more risky. And so whether you're a foundation or whether you're a public charity or whether you're more of an institutional investor, you should be more judicious about venture for the reasons for the reasons you outlined. I would say, though, that on the question of scale, our goal with Strada, at least, is really to scale. I think you reach the people on the margins, those that have faced the greatest barriers, those that have not had traditional success with either education or career or training. You reach them through scale, because typically companies and venture-backed entities will go after paying customers first to satisfy their investors, and oftentimes those paying customers are not the type of people that we are most principally interested in serving. So I would contend that you have to be intentional about ensuring that you're can research and measure the outcomes on those more sort of challenged populations, but that I struggle with how we will really move the needle for the people that have had the greatest sort of challenges and faced the greatest barriers without achieving scale, because that's where kind of that market failure, I think, historically has happened. So. Yeah,
and I think, just picking up on that, Tom, I think to a certain extent, but what we're seeing is that a lot of the scaled, if you even look at Harvard edX, they were just acquired by 2U, and what Alan, who's the provost at Harvard, said, he goes, we still didn't reach, as much of the work that we did, we still didn't reach the folks who have the most barriers to employment. And so I think if we're not baking that in as we're thinking about scaling our solutions, it doesn't happen by accident. And so we're interested in investing in solutions who are tuning for that. And there's different ways that they're doing it. I think about social finance, and they're thinking about how folks will pay for it and how they'll be able to pay for it. We're really thinking about entrepreneurs who are thinking holistically about how they're going to be inclusive and have an actual plan to reach that target market.
Yeah, I think if I could just add one more thing to that. I think Angela brought up an excellent point about there being different paths. One of the things that my team really acts as is a traffic cop, effectively directed people to different areas. So we get a lot of requests to our team, which are really not deals that are actionable for us. However, we can direct people to R&D, direct people to our grant-making areas, and I think that's really how we can bring sort of the broader wealth and benefits of ETS to be viable for a much larger audience. So I think that these are all complex things which are not going to be solved in one day, but I think the more we can sort of push forward at multiple efforts over time, I think we will cause some change.
The only thing I want to add that I feel I wouldn't forgive myself if I didn't say is that, coming back to your point, Tom, philanthropy has the capacity to be incredibly risky. The only accountability structure we have is to the IRS, and it's pretty light. So the accountability that we put on ourselves is really important, and we hold ourselves to a high standard, and I appreciate that. I don't want it to go away, but we have not just the opportunity, but I think the responsibility to be risky. When I say that philanthropy should be society's risk capital, I mean that really, really concretely. Like, we don't have to only invest in programs that have demonstrated X years of this much impact in this way. That's what we hope to get them to, but it doesn't have to be where we start.
I think that having been in this space for a long time, that is 100% spot on. There is a real desire. I think I mentioned earlier a desire to design the perfect mousetrap out of the box. And that is, you need a strategy. You can't be undisciplined, but there needs to be a certain element of risk and innovation to any strategy that you put forth. Because if our sector doesn't do it, no one else will. You do have the private sector that's willing to do it, but the private sector, they don't share our same goals and motivations. And so there's a real, having been around this a long time, there's a need to have a strategy so you're disciplined and you're focused, but you cannot design the perfect mousetrap out of the gate. I think occasionally we think as if we're conducting like some kind of experimental design program with human beings, and the world doesn't work that way. And so, yeah, I completely agree. I think that's a great point.
I think the only point I'd add to what Kathy just said is that, one would like to think that we are less risk averse. Well, we're not. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll be really frank. We are an extremely risk averse community, and change seems to be extremely slow. I think change in education is slow, but if you look to our part of the educational spectrum, it's extremely slow. And I think until we can actually get past that and start to move quicker, we won't really see much change. And the issue is not the money. There's lots of money sitting at this table right now, huge amount of capital. It's not the capital. It's willingness to actually take risks and to execute.
So I'd love you all just to reflect on that as we sort of wrap up our conversation of if that's the case, even though we're seeing this, relatively speaking, tidal wave of changes and new models and willingness to use new tools, why is that risk aversion in many foundations, perhaps not with you all, but in other parts, why is that still there?
I think there's a reputational risk. I think back to the early days of the Gates Foundation back in the early 2000s, like the early the Small Schools Initiative. They took a bet. I used to work for Gates, complete disclosure, but they made a bet and they got kind of, I thought, unduly criticized for it. They made a bet, it didn't turn out, and so they changed. That's not a failure, and yet there's a reputational risk that it's easier to play it safe. It's easier to provide scholarships or other things, and those are important things. Don't get me wrong, but there's a reputational risk that a lot of funders, whether you're a public charity, whether you're a foundation, that I think prevents foundations from being more provocative. So,
I think since I've pushed back on my own sector so hard, I'll give us some grace now too. I think it's also hard, especially if you have this motivation to see huge impact, to see real change. It's hard to play with people's lives. And so I don't want to be too glib about the way in which we should approach these sort of experimental things. We have to do no harm, absolutely, which is why in our philanthropy, the notion of being driven by inquiry, the notion of really being thoughtful about what is our hypothesis here, what do we think is going to happen, what do we think we can learn from it, and checking in along the way to figure out if that's actually happening, and if it's happening, for the grantee or the partner too. It's not just about us. But it is a difficult thing to do, and it requires also for us to sort of move the historical barriers that we erected. So, the boards and the reporting and the applications that we're also entrenched in using, we, in many ways, have to flip those things around if we're going to do things differently. And that takes a lot of internal work, and each foundation is its own entity, highly bespoke, because we don't have a sort of commonality. So it's on each leader and each leadership team at an organization to figure out how you can start to see that change happen too.
Last question is, I don't mean to pick at your aversion to ecosystem as a word, but I think I'm going to go there, which is that a number of you talked about the desire to have systems change, but you're betting on entrepreneurs and individual actors. There's some, I don't know if tension's the right word, but there's some question, I guess, of if government or incentives are sort of creating the system. How are these bets on individual actors changing that over time? And how do you all think about that when you're saying we're trying to go for systems change, we're trying to scale to change the system, and yet they're still working within many of these structures?
I'm not sure if ecosystem or systems change, or I'm not sure which one is my
Which one is your,
word.
I'm trying to go right at you, though, with it.
So I think it really gets back to what we were discussing earlier, which is that philanthropy, I think, is about being catalytic. It's about taking risks. It's about identifying what works, and then working with, in terms of our stakeholders, at least at Strada, I know you all have the same set of stakeholders, working with governments to scale and to take what we learn and then scale and propagate it. That's extremely complicated. That doesn't happen frequently. But the alternative is, I just don't think government and others will ever take the risk. It's not what they're designed to do. It's not. So it doesn't happen often, which is one of the reasons I don't particularly care for the term. But it's important because philanthropy won't be able to change the world, but it can identify what works. And then working with government, working with policymakers, hopefully, despite the sort of challenges we face at that level now, there can be a relationship where we can then scale what works through government. But you can also scale what works through other actors as well. It just won't be as large. But that's the way I think about systems change. We have the obligation to identify what works, especially for the least advantaged, and then working with government and others to scale what works. So.
Yeah, for us, we think about entrepreneurs when we're investing is that, they're singularly focused on their business, but they're really understanding what the other swim lanes are and who they need to collaborate with to reach scale. And those collaborators, that's when we think about the ecosystem. We just had this Future of Work Grand Challenge initiative, which was $15 million that we invested. The entrepreneurs came up with accelerated learning solutions, but they were going to be deployed in the public workforce system. And so for us, they had to really have an understanding of that system. So they're focused on training. They'll do it in employers, but they're also open to this public system. And for us, we want entrepreneurs who are more expansive in their thinking when they're thinking about scale.
I would add to that by saying, I really think we have an obligation to do something, to really execute on this. I think that, yes, we have to build some complex relationships, work with a number of different stakeholders, but I think we have to do something. And I think the key thing is all of us around this table are focused on doing something. So what I would hope is that, if we're all gathered around the same table, 2-3 years from now, there's actually been some measurable, actionable progress that we can all talk about. To me, that's the key thing.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add, and y'all are getting a lot of insight into the strange things I say to my team, a lot of times I'll ask, are we hacking this or are we cracking it? And so when a system is broken, you can find ways to exploit it. And in our sense, we're doing that in a positive way so that more people can make their way through a broken system with a solution that is a hack. We'd like to orient ourselves more towards solutions that are cracking this so that they're breaking down the broken parts of the system and coming into them and changing them. But there's a balance, and so often we have to balance our short-term goal of seeing things happen, to your point, with a longer-term goal of seeing the system change more holistically. So we try to balance the portfolio across opportunities to do that in different ways. And when we do invest in something that's more of a hack, we hope that our long-term view on it is it's the sort of hack that will enable cracking in the future. That makes sense.
Yeah, no, so this has been a fascinating conversation. I think we've dug into a lot of the trends, motivations, what's holding us back, and some of these tensions. And I hope you all have benefited as much as I have. But if you would join me in thanking these trailblazers.